Committee on Natural Resources will resume its sitting. Recognize you. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Alaska, Mr. Young.
And thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for coming back, too. I know how difficult it is in this busy schedule. And thank the witnesses for testifying. Mr. Malott, I understand that some members of the Green Group, which I'm not sure who they are, other than they sent a letter, I think, this Green Group, on February 25th to Senator Bingham, have expressed opposition to the legislation. The Green Group letter says that Sealaska has proposed to eliminate boundaries that limit where Alaska Natives can select land in southeast Alaska. The ANCS's legislation, the Green Group members say, required a complicated balance of public and private interest. How would you characterize the public and private balance that focused Sealaska into the boxes of southeast Alaska, 1971?
Representative Young, Mr. Chairman, I'm wondering if we might display a map.
I believe, Mr. Chairman, is that all right? Yeah.
Okay.
I don't know whether we can read a paper map anymore. We're so used to the computer. But go ahead.
It would just show you the Tongass National Forest, and what you see in red, Mr. Chairman, and members of the committee, are essentially all of the conservation areas in the Tongass National Forest today, plus in orange an additional roughly 5 million acres that a work group at the Tongass Futures Roundtable brought forward some months ago. The Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act village and regional corporation selections exist around villages, and you really can't make them out.
Are they the green ones?
They're the small yellow ones.
Yellow ones?
And then Sealaska has its primary selections on Prince of Wales Island, which are identified there also. But looking at the history of ANCSA, my wife is, as you know, Congressman, is a Doyon shareholder from the village of Rampart in your region, and Doyon, with fewer shareholders than Sealaska, ultimately has selected around 12 million acres as its entitlement under ANCSA. Sealaska, with at least at the time of ANCSA passage, with at least half again the number of shareholders of Doyon, was circumscribed in its selection within the withdrawal areas that are one of the core subjects of this hearing, and our ultimate allocation will be limited to roughly 300,000 acres, plus or minus. Sealaska's as a regional corporation, our selections are much smaller than even most village corporations in the rest of the state who have ANCSA entitlement also. Having said that, we recognize the fact that the Tongass National Forest is where we live, and it is where those selections necessarily had to be made. But at the time, that is the mid to late 60s, just prior to passage of the act, the state of Alaska was less than a decade old. It had the right under the Statehood Act to select up to 103 million acres of land around the state. It was already looking at land in the Tongass. It was able to select some lands in the Tongass, but even state selections within the region were very modest. At the time, there were two long-term timber contracts to provide federal timber contracts that authorized two pulp mills in the region, one in Ketchikan and Sitka, to harvest timber for pulp. Those mills at the time were just beginning to move into full production. There were municipal entitlements taking place at the same time under municipal statutes created by the new state of Alaska. And essentially, the Native Claims Settlement Act selections existed within that milieu, and ultimately, as you might imagine, from the amount of acreage that we ultimately were able to select, we were at the very end of the line.
Okay, Byron, let me say though, the public interest, all the public had interest selected their lands prior to you, really.
Yes, we were at
State, municipality, etc. This is before the Alaska Native Land came, so there was public input.
yes.
Okay. Now, having said that, Mr. Chairman, I want to look at this map as read. We're talking about 60,000 acres of previously selected land that were harvested. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. And so there has been that type of activity taking place where the public has had input. This is not something new. And I keep going back, as I had when I had USDA there. This is land that was considered of no value, which leads me up to the next question. The Green Group says that the land Sealaska would select under this bill are the most biological rich in the forest. Now, he goes to the gentleman that Mr. Hernandez said that you're talking about old growth. You're not talking about old growth in this bill. You're talking about previously harvested areas. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay.
It's
Get to you.
It's also, I think, important to note that when you refer to the what we call second growth areas, previously harvested, roaded by the U.S. Forest Service, that the reference, to my knowledge, to the fact that it is now among the most biologically important area in the Tongass National Forest, what is now roaded second growth, is that it is being called, and this comes from my involvement with the Tongass Futures Roundtable, where the environmental interests sit at the table and we discuss these things at every meeting. It is not being called, Congressman, second growth. It is being called, what's it being called? Restoration. It is being called a restoration forest. And the ultimate value is determined in that it is the aspiration of those who seek to eliminate Sealaska's potential settlement there, that it will become old growth once again, that it will never be harvested. And that, Mr. Chairman, is where that value definition comes from. It is not my definition, but that is the ultimate aspiration.
39 years is really nothing. They're talking about 100 years before you get your selections. Unless you select old growth. And like I just mentioned to the USDA, if we select old growth and there's no lawsuits, I'd be supportive of that. But you can't select that old growth timbers there now because they're not going to let you do that. We fought this battle every time.
Mr. Chairman, I would just say that as part of the Tongass Futures Roundtable, and I don't represent Sealaska as a member of the Tongass Futures Roundtable, I was the founding chair of the Nature Conservancy of Alaska, in addition to the other responsibilities that I've had over the years. And so the notion of conservation is very important to us as Native peoples also. But the idea that in our withdrawal areas there are roadless old growth, significant stands of roadless old growth, and in order to rationalize Sealaska not moving outside of its existing withdrawal areas, which are extremely limited, that somehow the areas that are now roadless old growth, which we would essentially be forced to select within our withdrawal areas, are less valuable to the public interest and even to ours by implication than already roaded second growth, is a brand new argument ripped out of whole cloth.